Mr. Goodman, I'd like to start by asking you a question. You talked in your presentation and you also mentioned in your brief about abandoned and orphaned wells. Your brief references the $1.72 billion that the industry received from the government to address some of those wells, but that there's a $70 billion gap still that exists in addressing the need to reclaim or close those wells. Who's responsible for doing that?
Thank you very much. The industry is responsible for doing that, and we take ownership over that. We do appreciate the federal government's program to get Canadian workers back to work, and I think there were some good decisions there on the part of the federal government to move forward on that. Thank you.
Okay, good. And so that gap now between the almost $2 billion that you have and the $70 billion that's estimated still required, any ideas on where that's going to come from or how we could address that? Because I actually see, like you've already mentioned in your last answer, is that this is actually a job creation thing in addition to being environmentally responsible and being good stewards.
Yes. So, I mean, first, the numbers are actually quite difficult to work out. So whether it's $70 billion less or it really doesn't matter. So I'm not going to specify what the number is there because actually it really depends on how you look at it. I can say the industry has put extra effort to this. I think they've recognized that investors are actually expecting them to do that. Canadians are expecting them to do that. And there's a broad commitment to do that. I can say also that the provincial governments, the way they've moved in British Columbia, Saskatchewan, and in Alberta recently is to put in place new policies, new procedures, whether those be timelines or percentage of spend targets. Those are appropriate policies, particularly at a time right now when prices are difficult. And as prices recover, there should be more money and more effort put towards that. And that is a commitment by the industry.
Okay, and so does the industry actually have a pool of funds that they have? Is it something that somebody administers for them, or does the association look after it, or is it individual companies and well owners that need to make that provision?
So it's a bit of both. So how it generally works is generally there's two forms to any of these programs. Policies will take different forms, but it's relatively simple. It's on basically just like your household income. What is your assets that are coming in? What are your liabilities associated with that? That's called an asset to liability ratio. And then the industry backstops with their money, and it's in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Any company that is financially distressed and is not able to deal with their liabilities goes into what they call an orphan fund, and the industry then pays for that. And they all are administered slightly differently, but they all have the same basic process there. And I should mention, as a former energy regulator, I have quite a lot of expertise on the implementation of these programs.
Thank you both. We'll switch over to Mr. Poilievre. We may.
And for your testimony today.
Looking at shutting down the meeting, Mr. Poilievre. So if you could, Falk, I don't see Pierre. Pierre, you there? Mr. Falk?
Yes,
there
I am.
Go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. I have here the global demand for oil for 2019. Now, this is obviously pre-COVID, but it was 100 million barrels per day, and that was an increase from the preceding 5 years, which runs in a contradiction to the common misconception that oil is now a thing of the past. In fact, the International Energy Agency anticipates continued demand of at least 60 million barrels per day for decades to come. So again, oil will be produced. The question is by whom? In North America, while our industry has been decimated in Canada for the last 5 years, it has doubled, production has doubled south of the border. So we're seeing more money, more jobs go to less environmentally friendly sectors south of the border while we decimate ourselves. Would either of the oil and gas witnesses be willing to comment on what we're doing to our own national economic interests by driving oil and gas production out of our country to less environmentally friendly jurisdictions?
We'll take the
I can
time to
certainly
go to
comment
both.
on that, but
Okay.
perhaps I'll ask Mr. Scholz if he would like to go first, if that's okay.
The interpreter would ask the witness to hold up the inline microphone, please.
Yeah, great. So, I would agree. I mean, I think at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter what forecast you're looking at, although they are, some of them are quite different than one another's depending on different stated policies. But the reality is the world's going to consume more energy. As Canadians, I know that we're committed to looking at climate change very seriously. But the reality is if we harm the industry, i.e. the oil and gas industry, and the service sector that is embedded in that industry, we will not be able to develop into hydrogen, geothermal, have a robust petrochemical industry, and also to deal with our growing energy demands here as a country. So we have to be very pragmatic about our approach and ensuring that our existing industries in the oil and gas industry are sustainable in the long term to not only supply Canadians with these products, but also internationally. We can either get it from Canada or you can get it from the Saudis or the Iranians. And I think most Canadians would choose Canadian product.
Okay, yeah. Mr. Goodman, if you could in 30 seconds.
Absolutely, Mr. Chair. Thank you. Mr. Poilievre, thank you for the question and nice to see you again. The International Energy Agency that you referenced is the gold standard. It predicts that you will see an increase in all energy use, including renewables, by the way, of which a number of previous oil and gas companies are starting to enter. I think there's great opportunity in the future for Canadians across the whole energy space. It's not a one versus the other. I do think, though, we have to ensure foreign capital is coming into Canada so that we can invest in all types of energy sources. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all. Split between Ms. Dzerowicz and Mr. Fragiskatis. Ms. Dzerowicz, you're up first.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. And I want to thank everyone genuinely for excellent and important presentations. Because I only have 2.5 minutes, I can only ask one of you questions. And unfortunately, because Mr. Julian actually asked the same questions that I was going to ask on electric vehicles to Mr. Breton, I'm going to actually turn my attention to Mr. Scholz. Mr. Scholz, in the 6 minutes that Mr. Kelly asked you questions and basically blamed only Liberal policy over the last 6 years for what's happening in the oil sector, I actually did a quick search just to show that a lot of foreign investment is fleeing the oil sands in Canada because it is high cost, it is high carbon. Not only is it a high cost jurisdiction, but it's producing lower quality oil. There's regulatory challenges, there is interprovincial issues, there's lack of pipeline capacity, and there's actually also lack of investment in capital from the companies that are actually here. So irrespective of all that, I wanted to ask, I thought that you had made, I think, some very interesting points and I think important points. There is a transition that's happening. We are moving to a low carbon economy. We do want to make sure that there is a transition to renewable energy and clean technology and clean energy. And one of the things you had said is that, tell us what are the rules of engagement moving forward. And I felt that was a fair ask. And so I wouldn't mind if you could elaborate exactly what you feel is not clear right now in terms of rules of engagement moving forward.
Well, I mean, I think there's just a lot of unknowns right now. I mean, I think we have seen, just to give you an example of C69, where, when you talk about pipeline infrastructure, that's desperately needed and will continue to be needed in Canada. I just have to look at Chris Bloomer, the president and CEO of the Canadian Energy Pipeline Association, that had mentioned that basically he and his association don't really see a proponent that would be willing to go through the process under C69 to actually see another pipeline get built here in Canada. So I'm not a pipeline expert. I just, I'm kind of looking at other sources that would indicate to me that the C69 in many ways is broken from an industry perspective. And I think the industry worked really hard with trying to provide some amendments that would make it workable. We weren't successful in that. So I do think that C69 is still problematic. There's still a lot of unknowns with the clean fuel standards and how that's going to be ultimately implemented. And so I think at the end of the day, when I say we want some certainty as to what the goalposts look like, it really means, what is the regulatory framework that we're going to be operating in? And for industry and government to really work hand in hand to ensure that, when we have these objectives, have these emission objectives, that we're not, we're not kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater here, so to speak, that we're actually working with these industries that are ultimately going to help us achieve some of those long-term aspirational goals.
Okay, thank you both, Mr. Fragiskatis. With you, you've confirmed previous testimony that we've heard from people like Mayor Cote from the City of New Westminster and Mayor Hurley from the City of Burnaby about the overall impact on municipal services during this pandemic, and thank you for that. I'd like to ask you three questions specifically about the housing issue, because that is an issue that is top of mind here in the Lower Mainland of British Columbia. We are simply seeing an increase in homelessness as the pandemic worsens many of the socioeconomic conditions that existed prior to. You mentioned that there was a federal government-owned building with 36 units that I understand is empty. I'd be interested in knowing how long that federal building has been empty for, because obviously 36 units is a considerable start in terms of addressing housing. You've talked about a substantial increase in funding, and I couldn't agree with you more. $7 billion seems to be a very important first start, and the Rapid Housing Initiative doesn't meet in any way the huge demand of hundreds of thousands of families across the country. So what has been the impact of the lack of housing in Yellowknife now? And what would be the impact if we were talking about a 10 or 15 or even a $20 billion program that put shovels in the ground and started building affordable housing across the country? I raise that because in British Columbia, as you're probably aware, the BC government has built more housing than every other jurisdiction put together, including the federal government, by simply moving to putting in place modular housing to make sure that affordable housing units are purchased and put into place. So what would be the impact of the federal government really stepping up and investing double figures in billions of dollars to ensure that housing was available for everybody who needs it?
Thank you for the questions. So yes, it's called Aspen Apartments, and it's a 36-unit apartment building. It's been empty since 2019. They were looking to transfer it to a local NGO, but the way that the transfer program works, the NGO was going to have to put $4.5 million on their books as a liability, and for the NGO that just wasn't an option because it was going to impact their borrowing limits. So it didn't go through, and then COVID hit, and so the federal government did transfer the asset to the territorial government to use right now, so March 2020 till the following March. But following that, our request is that the federal government look to transfer it to a local NGO again, and to not go back to use it as federal employee housing, because our private market here is sufficient and federal employees make enough to rent on the private market. In regards to homelessness and the need for both affordable housing as well as supportive housing, COVID's really seen with, we were in a lockdown, and nobody outside of your house was supposed to be living or visiting you and stuff. So a lot of hidden homeless really became obvious as people weren't welcome to come and couch surf and stay with friends and relatives. And so then there's that increase in the shelter space that's required. The worry is that if community transmission did happen in Yellowknife, like Nunavut, where with Arviat, households of 10 plus people, all of a sudden the numbers skyrocket in just a matter of days. So it's really important. And it's tough to get those numbers because hidden homelessness and couch surfing and the dangers that come with that, the fact you're putting yourself in vulnerable situations. So the housing is really important, and we've got 15 families on the wait list to get housing, and that means that kids aren't being able to get a good education and that stability that they need to be good contributors to the economy in the future. So across the country, I think we all know.
Last question,
Thank you very
Peter.
much.